This is the story of the discovery of a bullet-scarred Bible found in a chest of drawers in Cradley Heath in 1971, which led researcher David Williams to the story of Sgt Alfred Willetts of the 4th Battalion of the Royal Worcester Regiment.
On the 12th of February 2004, the Black Country Bugle newspaper published a letter from David Williams, a reader living in Cornwall who, back in 1971, had bought a chest of drawers from a second-hand shop in Cradley Heath High Street. In the bottom drawer of the chest, he had found the Bible of Sgt Alfred Willetts and was now looking for descendants or family members of Alfred to whom he could pass the Bible.
Alfred Willetts was born in 1887 or 1888. The son of James and Eliza Willetts, he lived at 151 Beecher Street, Cradley, and in the 1901 census, his occupation was given as ironmonger's apprentice. He attended Cradley Church of England School, and his name is recorded on their Roll of Honour. He was also associated with Two Gates Ragged School.
3 weeks after the Bugle article appeared, Graham Hodgson responded with a picture of Alfred Willetts and the World War I action in which he lost his life. The County Express of June 2nd, 1917 reported,
"News has just reached Mrs. James Willetts, Colligate, Cradley, that her son, Sgt Alfred Willetts, Worcesters, has fallen in action. Sergeant Willetts, who was a single man, had completed about 8 years' service and was recalled from India in February 1915. He was able to reach home in time to attend his father's funeral and then proceeded to the Dardanelles, where he was wounded whilst bringing in a wounded comrade, a dum-dum bullet hitting him in the lower part of the back. In the special order from General Headquarters, May the 12th, 1915, Sergeant Willetts was mentioned by Lieutenant Colonel Cayley, commanding the battalion."
It is a sad feature that Sergeant Willetts had been recommended for a commission, which he would have received the week following his death, which took place about May 13th. He was a member at Colligate United Methodist Chapel and of Two Gates Men's Own. The news of Sergeant Willetts' death was conveyed to his brother at Holy Cross, Clent, by Corporal Cooper of the same company.
"He got hit about 3 yards from me. I bandaged him up and got him carried into a trench, but he died peacefully afterwards. It was a great shock to me, as he was a great chum of mine and was in the same company with me in Burma and elsewhere. He was one of the bravest men I have ever known and was liked and respected by every man in the regiment."
By the winter of 1916, the Battle of the Somme had run its course. Both the German and the British troops settled in to a cold and miserable time in the trenches, and endeavoured to recover from the enormous losses that both had suffered during the Somme battles. This was the third winter of the war.
For the British soldiers, there was only the prospect of more attacks against a resolute enemy who only yielded ground when it was physically impossible to retain it, and then only after a series of furious counterattacks that made any British advance a very costly affair indeed. However, there was still a mood of optimism and a sense that, although the casualties in 1916 had been horrific, there had been considerable gains. It seemed that just a little more effort would break the Germans once and for all. To this end, the Allied generals planned their next major attack for April 1917. This was to be an attack near the town of Arras and along the Vimy Ridge, and would involve several of the British divisions which contained men from the Black Country. Launched after a barrage by 2,879 guns, starting on the 20th of March 1917, the attack was planned to break through the German defences and link up with the French forces attacking from the Aisne sector. The British had to penetrate 5 interlocking layers of defence, known as the Hindenburg Line, consisting of concrete pillboxes, trenches, barbed wire entanglements, and fortified towns and villages. These were backed up by thousands of artillery pieces, able to drop shells with pinpoint accuracy onto an attacking force. The attack would start at 5:30 a.m. on the 9th of April 1917 and be spearheaded by 40 tanks.
The 4th Worcestershire Regiment, including Sergeant Willetts, marched towards Arras on April the 1st and prepared for the attack that was scheduled for Monday, April the 9th.
Initially, the battalion was in reserve and waited in driving sleet for the order to move forward. This did not come until the morning of April the 12th, when the battalion marched into the town of Arras itself. It was not until 2 a.m. on the 13th of April that the Worcestershire men reached the actual front line, which was just south of the village of Monchay-le-Preux. An attack was ordered for later in the day, but was cancelled and then reissued for dawn of the next day.
It is hard to imagine what all this uncertainty did for the nerves of Sergeant Willetts and his colleagues, and the fact that there was a steady stream of casualties from enemy artillery fire would not have helped. The 4th Worcestershires would not make the initial thrust, but were again in reserve to follow through to attack secondary objectives.
Dawn on the 14th of April arrived, and the British bombardment of the German trenches intensified. The attacking battalions went over the top, but were met by a massive German counterattack, which all but destroyed the men from Essex and Newfoundland. The Worcestershire men fired rifles and machine guns frantically at the advancing Germans and managed to stop them about 100 yards from the British reserve trenches. Other German attacks were made throughout the day, but each met the same fate. As the day progressed, Worcestershire casualties steadily mounted. The survivors became exceedingly tired, to the point where they could hardly lift their rifles to the parapet. Late in the evening, the shattered battalions were finally withdrawn and replaced by fresh British troops. Compared with the other battalions in the brigade, the 4th Worcestershire casualties were relatively light.
The next 4 days were spent recuperating in cellars in Arras until the night of April the 19th, when the journey to the front line was undertaken under heavy shell fire, during which 1 officer was killed and 4 others, as well as 20 other ranks, wounded.
More casualties occurred the next day, April 21st. The order finally came for April 23rd and was to be carried out in 2 phases. Phase 1 was to be the capture of a hill known as Infantry Hill, and this fell to the 4th Worcestershire. Following the successful completion of this objective, the 2nd Hampshire were to pass through the Worcestershire position and capture 2 woods further on.
Just after first light on April the 23rd, the Worcestershire attack went forward through a storm of shells.
The German first line was reached and easily captured, and the attackers moved on up the hill with casualties mounting.
Within half an hour, the objective was reached and captured.
The survivors began to dig in and wait for the counterattacks that they knew would soon be hurled at the depleted British companies. Reinforcements were also expected from the Hampshire Battalion. The first of many furious German attacks came at around 10 a.m. and was resisted stubbornly.
However, the attack by a neighbouring division had failed, and the Worcestershires found themselves in a dangerous and isolated position, made worse by the casualties to the Hampshire Battalion, which suffered so badly that it was unable to provide any real assistance. The Worcestershires were on their own.
Almost all the Worcestershire officers were casualties, and the battalion suffered severe losses during the initial attack and throughout the long day of shelling and German counterattack. Eventually, relief did arrive, but it was long after midnight before the battalion was able to extricate itself and march back to Arras. Losses had indeed been heavy. Only 2 officers and 64 men marched back to Arras. The battalion war diary records they suffered 8 officers and 34 other ranks killed, 3 officers and 325 other ranks wounded, and 1 officer and 53 other ranks missing, suggesting this was the highest loss of any British battalion on one day throughout the Great War.
In all, 106 men were killed or died later of their wounds. Amazingly, the battalion was back in action days later.
A considerable number of Black Country men from Craiglie served with the 4th Worcestershire throughout the war. Many failed to return home and lay buried in foreign fields across the world. On the same day as Sergeant Willetts fell, 11 other local Black Country men from the 4th Worcestershire fell, as well as at least 10 local lads with other units. In the next few days, several others died of wounds.
As with most great war battles, many of the casualties have no known grave, but are commemorated on a memorial to the missing.
The Arras Memorial includes nearly 35,000 such names of soldiers who fell in the area around Arras during the latter part of the Great War. Sgt Alfred Willetts was one of the 158,660 recorded casualties sustained by the British Expeditionary Force in the Battle of Arras and Vimy Ridge.